Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host Giulio, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation about cars. Well, not really, but kind of. This is a conversation about the systems that have made our world so dependent on cars. So it's a conversation with Giulio Mattioli and Julia Steinberg about their article, The Political Economy of Car Dependence, a Systems of Provision Approach, which was published in the Energy Research and Social Science Journal some months ago. We discuss a number of topics that might seem at first kind of out of context, maybe, I'm not sure, but just bear with me. So these are the topics. We discussed the 5 key elements of what we're calling the car-dependent transport system. We discussed the problem with focusing too much on consumption and the importance of covering the production side of things as well. We discussed how where we live can actually influence our politics, how suburban car-oriented lifestyles, for example, are actually subsidized by the state. Then we discussed broader topics, the importance of network planning, the case for degrowth, and how the car industry is actually a pretty good example of why degrowth is necessary. We look at the problem with sustainable growth. We even discuss why more equitable societies are easy to decarbonize, and a number of other things. The idea here is that we look at the political economy of car dependence and use that as our anchor in this conversation to discuss these broader issues. Because the world we live in, a world that is so focused on cars, in similar ways as how we live in a world that's so dependent on aviation. And here I might recommend listening to episode 65, A Rapid and Just Transition of Aviation, Shifting Towards Climate Just Mobility. These are all highly political issues that are often depoliticized in, for lack of a better word, mainstream discourse. And indeed, even in academia. And even in activism. In fact, one of the reasons why I invited my 2 guests on to talk about this topic is that I think we often fall into a trap on the left in general of not understanding that consumption can be a problem. And in fact, consumption is a problem a lot of the times. It doesn't mean that it is the only problem, and indeed, as I said in this introduction, we say that it is a problem when we focus too much on consumption, especially if it comes at the risk of ignoring the importance of covering the production side of things. As with some of these episodes that have to do with the environment, this is a case, or I'm trying to make the case, that when we talk about the environment, it is difficult to do so without also discussing the context in which these questions are happening. So the issue with cars isn't cars themselves, but the fact that we live in a world that was built for them, for the prioritizing car mobility. So what does this mean? This is what a systems of provision approach tries to do. This is what we tried to get into in this conversation. As with these episodes, those that might seem more quote-unquote specialized at first, I hope you just give them a listen, because I think we make a very good case that it's not actually that specialized. It doesn't require you to know that much or to have some kind of like advanced knowledge of what we're talking about in order to follow this conversation and hopefully find it productive. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening and take care.
I am Giulio Mattioli. I'm research fellow at the TU Dortmund University in Germany.
And hi, I'm Julia Steinberger. I'm professor at the University of Lausanne and the Institute of Geography and Sustainability.
All right, well, thank you both for speaking with me. We'll be primarily chatting around the paper that you two co-wrote, and we'll use this to, broaden conversation a bit as well. So the paper is called The Political Economy of Car Dependence, a Systems of Provision Approach. Julia, on Twitter, you described the goal of the paper as such, and I'm quoting, to understand how different industries and policies come together to create the consumption of cars we argue that the real product of our age is not the automobile, but automobile dependence. And then you ask, how is this dependence created and fostered? And the paper is our answer, end quote. So with that in mind, can you both explain what the general gist of the paper before we can get into it a bit more? Like what is it about, and why did you feel the need to write it as well?
I guess I can tell sort of the long backstory, and then maybe Julia can go through the how we actually turned it into something quite wonderful. So the long backstory is that I try to research the energy requirements of well-being, which is a weird topic. Maybe it's getting to be a bit less weird. But one of the things that was clear in this research is that the energy requirements of well-being might not be very high or might be declining over time. So paradoxically, it actually probably takes less and less energy for people to live well. But one of the things that was going the other direction was transport. So transport's this category that people feel that they need a lot, but transport energy is going up. And the funny thing to me was when I would come to people with this result of like, hey, guess what? Good news. The energy requirements of human development are going down over time. Everybody would be like, okay, well, then our energy use should be decreasing. So I had to come up with a way to answer about what was standing in the way. And the thing that's standing in the way is our economy and the way it uses resources and transforms it into consumer goods. And one of the ways that that happens is through transport. And so it seemed like transport was a really core thing to understand better. And I had no way of doing that. So that is why I turned to Giulio, who it turns out knows a lot. So
So yeah, my backstory. It's funny how we our paths crossed in that way. Is that my main background is in like going really back in sociology and urban studies, but I had been focusing for a while on transport. And my focus had always been like what was standing in the way, in a way, like what was standing in the way of like making transport sustainable or reduce emissions in transport and so on. So that goes under the name of car dependence, like all this idea that we would need to reduce levels of car use. Because for example electrification won't be enough, like we will need to use cars less, but somehow we find it so difficult to do it. So like my broad interest is from everything which helps explaining that, but I had never looked at it from a political economy perspective, which I suppose was a bit in the back of my mind, but I would never have done it hadn't there been the opportunity to work with Giulio on this project. Um, so, with hindsight, was a great thing that we managed to meet at that point and to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I've just finished the entire paper today. It's really, really fascinating. I think it can kind of lead to different paths as well, and we'll try and get into some of them here. But like the gist of it is that you identify five key elements of what we'll be calling, and what you called in the paper, the car-dependent transport system. And I'll just list them. The automotive industry, the provision of car infrastructure, the political economy of urban sprawl, the provision of public transport, and finally, cultures of car consumption. First, can I just ask you to expand on these five a bit? Did you even just explain them if that's okay? And then I have a follow-up question to that, but if we can start with that.
Yeah. So the five. I'll just go very quickly through them. So the first one was the automotive industry, because we were trying, as I said. So one of the problems with, I think, sustainable transport discourse, and by that I include like both research and also things like activism, that it's very much focused on consumption. So like the idea, so why are people using cars? Why are people buying cars? And why are people buying this kind of car and not that kind of car, etc. So that's all on the consumption side. So we felt that one key element that was missing was the production side, right? Where are all these cars coming from? And it's surprising to think about that in sustainable transport research. This aspect is very much absent. So I think that's one of perhaps of the new things that this paper was trying to do, was like to look at the literature on that which exists but is disconnected from the others, and try to make the links between that and the other aspects. The second point is the car infrastructure, which is like broadly, like it's the idea that, so how did we get to the point where we have 1 billion, I don't know anymore, like 1 billion cars over this planet? It would never have happened if those had not been accommodated by, first taking street space away from other uses and other modes, and making it primarily about car traffic, and then by building a lot more of road space, right? And that's an element where the state plays a key role in, making sure that these things happen. So the third one, land use patterns. Like there's a lot of discourse and around sprawl, and if you live in a car dependent area where residential density is very low, it is very difficult to get by without a car. So how did we get to that point, and how does this element relate to all the other different elements? So that was what we were trying to do. The fourth one was public transport, because we saw it as the main competitor, so to speak, and we thought there was a political economy element there as well to explain. So in how do you set up a public transport system which is competitive with the car as much as possible? That's not something that is politically, it's not just a technical question. There are different models that can be followed there, and some are more suited to make sure that public transport can compete with car use. And the last element was the more cultural one. So everything which is more on the consumption side, related to the meanings associated with using cars, buying cars, and so on. Because we thought that that's a very important element. Although sometimes its importance, it's exaggerated when it's sometimes people pretend that this whole thing about cars, it's just that people developed a love affair with the car. That's a common expression. Just people just love them and that's it. So that's exaggerated, but there's certainly a lot of like cultural aspects which are linked with all the other bits in interesting ways. And fortunately, I just wanted to name him. Like we had Cameron Roberts, who's like the co-author, and who that he was like the main author of that section, really, because we would never have managed to write about those cultural aspects. I wouldn't have. That's not my forte. So these are the 5 elements.
And maybe I can also add something in terms of the story of the paper, which was, so I remember the first time we sort of sat down to talk about it, Giulio sort of walked into the office and he said, this is an insane thing. And but if we want to do it, we have to include at least these 5 aspects. And by the way, one of them I don't really know how to do, which is the cultural one. So we sort of parked that one for a while. But there's also the missing aspects that we sort of decided not to include in the scope of the study, which have to do with the petroleum industry, so the fossil fuel industry, all the energy and metal supplies upstream of the car industry. So all that sort of stuff that's upstream of either the car creation or the car production or the car use, we didn't look at. So we sort of looked from from the automotive industry and then not further, because we just had to draw a boundary around it, not because those elements are not interesting, just because we had to sort of say, okay, this is crazy enough.
Related to this, actually, you mentioned in the paper, you look at how sprawl, quote unquote, derives politics. I appreciate the pun here, by the way. As those who live in those areas, suburban areas, middle class areas, are more likely to support quote unquote hidden subsidies. I'm going to use a lot of these terms, so if it's okay, I'll ask you to also explain them. So let me repeat. As those who live in these areas are more likely to support hidden subsidies to automobility and oppose investment in alternative modes. And here there's a quote: suburban car-dependent areas have supported policies that reduce subsidies to public transport, maintain the quote-unquote hidden welfare state, supporting sprawl and automobility, and preserve the car's domination of street space, end quote. So if we were having cultural conversations, we might talk about, I guess I can read, the car industry actively supporting the development of car culture, both deliberately, advertising, and so on. I can think of just shows like Top Gear and just the popularity of cars being a thing to to enjoy and consume and all of that. Okay, so this will be one conversation, but the infrastructure level tends to be less focused on, or the structural level tends to be less focused on. And this is something like this quote that I read, like suburban car-dependent areas support policies that would prioritize car infrastructure, let's say, or car-friendly infrastructure rather than public transports, is something that I've seen, but I've never fully connected the dots in some way. So can I just ask you to expand on that a little bit?
So yeah, in that section, I'm drawing on the work of this geographer from Toronto, which is Alan Walks, and he's primarily, I think he came to this topic by looking at the increasing polarization in voter behavior between urban areas and suburban areas. So that's something that, at least in English-speaking countries, it's very clear. I think it's clear in other countries as well, but I can't say it applies to all countries 100%. But they definitely see from the 70s to now, like say in the 70s, like cities were not much more labor in the UK than conservative, but now they are, right? And the suburbs are really much more conservative than labor as compared to what they used to be. So there's been a trend in that direction, and there's a debate in geography, as far as I understand, as to why that is happening. And one explanation is like people have sort of sorted themselves into people who have that kind of political preference also happen to prefer to live in those areas, and over time they have like sorted themselves in spaces that they are more congenial to them. I suppose that's part of the answer, but this author was arguing that the other part of the answer is like just living in those places changes you, right? That by living in those places, say in a home that you own, using a car that you own and buy, and so on, will make you a bit more averse to more common goods, things like social housing or building blocks, or public transport, because you just don't see the point of those things. They are no use to you. As That's just me trying to put myself in those shoes. And the point about hidden subsidies, that like this suburban lifestyle in many ways is supported by public money, is supported by taxpayers, is supported by people who don't live in those areas, don't use cars, and so on. But that happens in less visible ways, right? Than things like public transport or social housing. So yeah, so those people tend to be very opposed to those alternative things, for which they probably don't see the use to them, but they tend to be very adamant about keeping those hidden subsidies, even denying that these are subsidies in the first place.
Can you explain a bit what you mean about they would like to keep those hidden subsidies in place? And yeah, there's that.
Yeah, I'm thinking things like the best example of hidden subsidies is always parking, free parking space. Like it's just something people take for granted, that there's huge amounts of free parking space, but parking space is not free at the end of the day, because when you like force every residential development to have a certain amount of free parking space as part of the residential development, that pushes up the costs of the residential development, and then eventually people who are buying or renting or those dwellings will end up paying more for the residents than they would otherwise if that free parking space was not provided. So that requires a little bit of thinking, and it's not clear that free parking space is being given to you by all those people who are paying more. It's all happening behind the scenes, but it is happening in that, like, public space is scarce, and we are allocating huge amounts of that to just people who happen to have cars for them to park it on. And if you try to suggest, let's take away parking space, or let's price it, then you suddenly, the people in the suburbs are often, I mean, I don't want to caricaturize, but that they can easily be up in arms and be outraged that something that is so common sense to them is being taken away from them. So that's just an example of what happens when you touch hidden subsidies.
And I think because I come from this from sort of a more general economics perspective, I think that there's definitely a class element of this, so that we have different economic narratives, right? So we have economic narratives around, the welfare scroungers. So they receive the overt subsidies. They receive housing assistance. They might receive preferential, subsidies for public transportation, whatever. Those are obviously infrastructures that are for less well-off people. But upper classes who live in houses, often single or double family units or whatever in more suburban areas, they're going to have more money, and they are actually going to be the great beneficiaries of a lot of wealth flows through taxation in general, or through these more indirect hidden mechanisms that Giulio referred to as hidden subsidies, including road building. That's another obvious one.
Yep.
But also things like mortgage tax breaks. That there's a whole sort of state support of this idealized lifestyle. And in terms of economic narratives, it's quite possible for people who live in those places to see themselves as self-made, independent, rugged individualists, right? That they see themselves as the self-made people because they're not, there's this polite fiction about the fact that they are not subsidized like people on welfare who live in subsidized housing, who depend on public services very openly are benefiting from welfare. So, it really reinforces this idea that they are the correct economic actors. They are the consumers. They are the people with autonomy. They are homo economicus effectively, and everybody else is sort of doing economics the wrong way, being a household the wrong way, from a mainstream economic narrative perspective. So it really, and if you've read any Ayn Rand, it sort of goes in this direction of everybody in there is the king of the house, is John Galt, is the sort of that whole narrative sort of comes to the fore of them seeing themselves really as yeah as meriting all of that wealth, all of that dominion. And the car is sort of the snail's shell. As you go from place to place, you're always enclosed in your own little personal fortress. So there's it reinforces it, as opposed to having to deal with anybody else. And if you start touching that, you start touching also not just people's economic interests or their convenience, but also to some extent aspects of their class identity, and how they see themselves being part of society. You're sort of starting to say, you don't deserve that stuff that we've been allowing you to get without making you see that we were in fact paying for it. So it makes them realize that they're interdependent, and they don't that's not what their identity is. So it's a really interesting conundrum that goes to basic economic categories, I would say, as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, the hiding of these categories in some ways, I think, or for me anyway, I don't know if it's a bit of a simplistic reading, but it's just an example of how what we usually think of economics or mainstream economics is really like one and the same with mainstream politics. At least they kind of go hand in hand. While you were talking, and that may be a caricature, but I was thinking of during the Black Lives Matter protest in the US, there was that scene where you had this couple and they were protecting their private property and they had a gun and they were invited by the GOP like a week later. And that was very much that contrast in very let's say photogenic way. It was very very obvious. But like a lot of what you were getting at as well, if I'm understanding correctly, Giulio, like you tweeted some time ago, quote, public transport is difficult to provide when land use is core oriented. So you mentioned that here as well. And then you add, you need network planning, but that requires some degree of public control. So how would you understand network planning, if that's okay?
But yeah, that was part of me. Like when I was preparing this paper, I had the chance to read this book by a guy called Paul Mees. Who was a he died, but he was a Australian planner, I think. And he wrote this book, which was, one of those books. I will recommend it at the end of the podcast. But it's one of those books. Was a bit of an eye-opening moment. So there's this in transport research. also in the common perception, I think there's this idea that like below certain levels of density, you just can't provide for public transport, just not viable, just won't work. And I suppose like if you take it to the extreme, yeah, I mean there probably is some level beyond which it. Uh, but what this book argues is that actually there are ways to provide like for public transport even in relatively suburban and relatively low density spaces. It just depends on how you do it. It's a bit more difficult, but you need to do this thing which is called network planning, which is basically trying to look at the whole thing as a network. So like integrated network of different public transport modes and different routes, all connected in certain dots, in certain, in certain exchange points at certain times, etc. That's often not the case when, like, it's often the case that services are planned in a disconnected way. It's also a question of like having some feeder services which are not making a profit, like because they're running relatively empty. They're not making a profit per se, but they allow you to bring people to those like more main services which do make a profit. And so overall, you're cross subsidizing between those. And but in order to do that, so the implication of that in order to do that, you need some sort of public oversight and at least some level of regulation, right? To make sure that this subsidization happens, right? And that's not the case in systems that are very much deregulated. Fortunately, there are not that many of those systems, but that there is one in the UK is a prime example there. So the UK has outside of London has completely deregulated bus transport. So basically, the bus operators just decide where to run buses, how to run them, at what time, which fare, and so on. And they can change what they do from a week to the next if they want to, etc. And the public will not force them to provide any services. What the public does is to pick up like the unprofitable routes and pay the bus operators to provide them for them. um, so basically, what Paul Mees is arguing is that if you're going for a system like that, there is no way you will ever get a public transport network which is competitive with the car, right? And having lived in Leeds, which is one of the major UK cities, and it's most of which consists of what people would see as relatively suburban areas, and it's just going from point A to point B. It's hell, like with buses. It's just most for I think for distances of up to 40 minutes an hour. If it's not on the main axis, you're just better off walking there. Like just and it's very hilly. So yeah, so you definitely it's that if you move to the UK from other places where public transport is more planned in a network way, like Germany, and then or you move back from the UK to Germany, you definitely see that like the difference is uh, like between night and day. And that's the difference between a model which is very much privatized and deregulated and a model which is not entirely public, but it's certainly more regulated and where the public has more of is more active in. So we just thought that this political economy aspect of public transport provision also fit into this broader discourse around car dependence.
Well, I guess I was learning about this mainly through Giulio's research and but the thing that really flabbergasted me the most was that when they were doing this in the UK, this massive deregulation, um, that they spared London, that they knew it was going to be a complete disaster and was going to make cities not function. So even the Thatcher government decided to spare London. So they really they kept Transport for Greater London, which has powers that no other locality in the UK has. And very often, I was in Manchester, I was in Leeds, and people say like, why can't our city government just do things like London? And it's like, actually, they're not allowed. Like, there's not this understanding that the rest of the country was sort of sacrificed, whereas London was protected. in terms of public transportation. I think that that really goes to show that the people who did this deregulation actually kind of knew what they were doing when they set up the experiment.
Yeah, and it's funny how it happened because like what I read is that they said let's deregulate, but they said okay, yeah, let's first try that outside of London, and then they saw how it was going and said, yeah, okay, maybe we won't do it exactly in the same way in London. So yeah, there was definitely a bit um, uh, um, of I think the rest of the UK was a bit of a guinea pig there, like Scotland with the poll tax or things like that.
Yeah, I lived in London. I couldn't imagine that ever. It would be a nightmare. The tube is difficult as it is, but at least it's functional, and most people love it. So I think they would secretly hate it even more if it was more deregulated. So kind of on a more I don't know, macro level or on a broader level, but a big part of this system that the car dependent transport system, I think it's fair to say, also relies on the persisting and dangerous notion, in my view, that we can continue to push for economic growth, basically uncritically and on basically in an unlimited way, despite at this point the pretty stark and overwhelming scientific evidence that showed the issues with that. I will mention. First, I will to kind of ask you your thoughts on sustainable growth, that buzzword. When is it used recklessly? When, if ever, can it be used in a responsible way? Before asking you that, I'll just mention that there was a recent analysis of, let me find it, 835 peer-reviewed articles on the subject of decoupling. So for those who don't know, the idea that growth can happen pretty much without environmental catastrophe, and which found that, quote, this cannot be achieved through observed decoupling rates. There's a good write-up of this on the New Republic. I'll just link it in the description for those who want to read more. And yet, my understanding as of now, anyway, is that this mechanism sort of is taken for granted, or at least not taken critically enough in international panels. The World Bank, as far as I know, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals even allow for that kind of limitation or flaws. I guess I would say, I don't know. But from your point of views, or even from your scientific knowledge, can you explain what's wrong with this notion, if anything, or how would you nuance it a bit more, if that makes sense?
I guess that's my question. So I should be completely honest. So I situate myself very much on the degrowth side of economic scholarship, I guess. And but I was looking for decoupling too. I mean, this is the thing, is that I was one of those studies where we had a bunch of countries and a bunch of data and we're looking for it. And I think there's a lot of blind faith in this idea. We have I've come to sort of understand it, that growth is sort of the secular religion of our time, that we want good things to come from growth. So growth is the greater purpose of our collective life. And then we want good things to happen as a result of it. And it's almost like this totem or this central thing that we feed, and then we expect it to feed us. And some basic ideas from that, for instance, came from the Kuznets curve. So Simon Kuznets, who was one of the great economists who developed the statistical machinery for measuring GDP, which is a huge work. And GDP is a useful indicator, just not of human progress and welfare, but it's a great indicator of aggregate economic activity, you know. But he had this idea that inequality first rises with growth and then goes down. And that turned out to be true in his time for what he was observing. But as a general hypothesis, it turned out to be false. But people sort of kept the notion that growth sucks at the sorry, I don't know what language we're allowed to use in your podcast, or
Anything.
if we're allowed to square
Yes,
words or not.
anything's fine.
Okay, so that growth sucks bananas at the beginning, like it's going to come with bad news and bad social consequences, environmental consequences, but afterwards it's going to be okay. And so people translated this idea of inequality growing with growth, but then decreasing with growth. to the environmental sphere. And so there's this idea of sustainable growth, which is, oh yeah, growth is going to be terrible at the beginning, but once you're past a certain point of prosperity, it's actually going to help you decouple your environmental impacts. It's going to help you be cleaner and greener and more prosperous, and so it's just going to be good all around. And that notion is really a zombie theory, because people have been demonstrating that it just doesn't work. It works for a very small class of pollutants. Um, you can basically if you look from environmental studies, you can categorize your pollutants as three, that in terms of their impact on human health. So you have a certain class of pollutants, which would be, for instance, that cause infectious disease. So that's things like dirty water, things that would spread cholera, things that would spread bacteria. And those just decrease with growth. Like the infectious disease ones, they don't they don't go up with growth, they just go down. There are ones that do go up with growth and then down, and those are the intermediate ones that are, for instance, atmospheric pollution in cities that have to do with early stages of industry. Um, those do, so they behave like you would want your environmental Kuznets curve to behave. And then they're the ones that just keep growing with growth. And the fact is that the biggest problems we have to do with climate change, biodiversity loss, land use, etc., behave in this way, where in terms of their association with growth, they increase with growth. And in terms of their impact on our health, they're more distant, which is they have more of a diffuse, global, long-term effect, which is why we don't translate them directly into our economy, into our reaction. We don't react as fast as we would with other pollutants that have a more immediate effect on our health. So that's what we're facing. Is we're facing. I completely agree that this idea of sustainable growth is a dream. It does not correspond to reality. I completely agree with the study which looks at these peer-reviewed studies across the board. That their conclusions are correct. Even when there is decoupling, it's not going fast enough to avert the kinds of catastrophes that we're facing. So we have to face a different economic model. And that's where I think the example of car dependence and bringing us back to the automotive industry is really interesting. And maybe I'll just let Giulio take it from there, because one of the things that you see is that most major economies have at their industrial heart something related to the automotive industry, whether they're making parts for it or whether they have actual automobile manufacturing. And after each economic crisis that we've seen in the past, 2 decades, one of the ways that the governments try to restart the economy is to keep that industry going at all costs by providing rebates, by doing cash for clunkers, which was like one of the most expensive carbon abatement programs ever per ton carbon. I mean, so they do all these things to keep that industry afloat, despite the fact that in a recession, people very rationally would prefer to not spend a lot of money on cars. That's something they can save money on right away, then they would do it. So there's a reason why that industry has a hard time degrowing. So that industry is very fragile and in fact demands a growth-based economy, which is also environmentally unsustainable. But maybe Julia can talk more about that.
Yeah, I can talk more about that. Like, so going back to the automotive industry, one of the things that we found out reviewing this literature was that so the key to understand it is like capital intensity and economies of scale. So cars, up to a point, they were made of like different materials, including wood, and they were made in different. I think the chassis and the other part, I forgot. I'm very bad when it comes like to the specifics of the vehicles, but they were made in a different way. And at some point, they started to be made as like all steel body. So the idea that there's this like sort of steel bubble, which is a single thing, which yeah. So that helped with a lot of like production bottlenecks at the time, but it created a need for like a lot of, so it just works, it just make profit out of that production if you really have like a huge factory which chunks out a lot of cars which are made pretty much in the same way. So it's got very high economies of scale, and that's sort of like explains the trajectory of the car industry since then, which has like been going towards like concentration. There are like, it's a bit more complicated than that, but there are some very very big car companies in the world, as opposed to having, say, thousands of very small ones. And that's because of economies of scale. And that also makes them very unsuited to cope with any fluctuation in demand. So, like, if demand goes up, they will build a new factory. But if it goes down, they have that new factory which needs to produce like a million vehicles over a certain period of time to just be profitable. So they would just produce them and cut the margins to whatever um, point just helps them to sell them, or they will ask for subsidies from the state, which is how they tend to keep going in these downturns. Um, so yeah, there's one, like a lot of what we say about the car industry in that paper is based on the research of mainly two researchers, Peter Wells and Paul Neuwenhuis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Apologies if I am not. But they have a lot of books about it, and one of them from 2003, where they have this sentence which stuck with me and which used in the paper, which is like, it's not like a specific product which is unsustainable, right? Like the internal combustion engine vehicle or the SUV, say, it's the whole logic of the automotive industry which is unsustainable, because it's geared towards producing more and more and more and more and more of those vehicles, regardless of any consequence, really. And there is no way to say to I don't know how to put it, to just to control that reaction and to harness it in a positive way. It's just that the tendency towards overcapacity and overproduction is just too strong, in a way. But there's something else I wanted to say about growth and degrowth. Just going back to that point, if I may, is I'm not as outspoken as Giulia in these debates. Mainly, although I have, clearly I'm more sympathetic to the degrowth side. The reason why I'm not as outspoken is because I don't feel qualified enough, because I'm more of a sectoral specialist, right? And as long as we're talking about transport, I can state my point of view with a certain self-assurance. But if we're going beyond that, I'm not as qualified. But what I would say is that if you were to pick a sector to make a case for degrowth, you would probably pick transport, right? Because like transport is, as compared to other sectors like domestic housing and so on, it just really shows that over time, increases in travel activity have systematically negated like any increase, any improvement in energy efficiency, in carbon intensity, and so on. And that's just been the story of transport since we've had motorized transport, right? So there's a lot of people going around and saying, no, but this time is different. To which I'm like, yeah, well, but the burden of proof is on you. But certainly it is, I mean, it requires a leap of faith to believe that this like very very strong coupling between economic growth, travel activity, and carbon emission, transport related carbon emissions will suddenly decouple to an extent which is compatible with climate mitigation. It really does. So yeah, I think like sustainable transport and degrowth, in a way, it's a match, because we it is very hard, like if you're coming from a sustainable transport perspective, to believe in that story, right? What do you think, Julia?
I certainly agree. But I don't know. Maybe we're drifting too far, and Joey has other questions for us. We could keep going on this topic.
No. I think it's actually, my next question was about aviation, which is also a big problem on when it comes to investments and the obsession with growing and prioritizing aviation friendly industries and infrastructures instead of anything else. And the UK is a good example of that, and so is America, unfortunately. But no, continue. I'll just ask it in a bit.
Yeah, well, I guess there's the research that we did with Giulio and Cameron and also Andrew Brown at Leeds was part of this project on living well within limits that I had the good fortune to acquire, and the as another part of this project, so another research component, we were doing very sort of quantitative, let's look at energy footprints of different income classes kind of thing. And one of the things we found as part of that research is it's not surprising, but maybe it's surprising how universal it was across the world, is that higher income classes use more transport. So again, this idea of the environmental Kuznets curve, we also have it as an idea of like rich people can afford to be clean, rich people can afford to be green, rich people will have refined immaterial tastes to do with going to the opera and acquiring expensive artwork. And that's maybe true for some people, but it's not true for most people. So what we really see is we really see higher income being translated into energy intensive forms of transport, be it flying or car use. Being the two main ones, but also boat use. I mean, why not? All across all categories of transport, we see this, and that means that one of the implications for that actually means that because transport is this poster child for all things, you know, it's coupled to economic growth, it's horrifically polluting, and requires a lot of resources, emits a lot of carbon, uses up a lot of energy. Um, that it's actually also one of the categories of energy use that's the hardest to decarbonize. And if we're going to talk about flying, that's very, very true for the aviation industry, even more so than for the automotive industry. But it is a hard to decarbonize sector compared to heat and electricity, which are relatively easy to decarbonize in contrast. And so one of the things that we came to the conclusion as a result of the research in this project that was just published earlier this year, which is that more equitable societies are easier to decarbonize because if you basically keep people's energy consumption the same but redistribute it to make it more evenly, to make it more economically equitable, what people will use energy on is they will use it on housing. They'll use it on dwellings to have more decent, you know, that's what the vast majority of people aspire to, is a decent dwelling with electricity and heat and cooling and all of that, and appliances and so on. And that is easy to decarbonize compared to transport. So it's also this question, there's again this sort of class element to it, or this economic inequality element to it, which I think is also quite interesting.
Like the question of the aviation industry. I had an episode recently, that's episode 65 for those listening, with Anne Kretschmar of the Stay Grounded Network. And the title of the episode is the title of the paper that she co-authored as well. A rapid and just transition of aviation, shifting towards climate just mobility. So it's kind of like the conversation was sort of along the lines of what we were discussing here as well. As you said, our parallels between the two. She discussed many of the ways out of the dependency on aviation. We focus on Europe, but not just, and we focus as well on the social aspect of it, how to also think of the workers that work in the aviation industry, so that they don't just lose their jobs, to actually have transitions in a social justice oriented manner. I will note, just kind of like as a way of exemplifying that conversation, just like a few days ago, like before this chat, Reuters and we're recording this on April 13th, just for noting. Reuters announced that France approved a ban on short domestic flights that can be covered by train in under 2.5 hours, which is good. But at the same time, the French government contributed, or is planning to contribute, 4 billion euros in recapitalization of Air France. So on the one hand, this is apparently a good move, and on the other hand, as is almost always the case with these policies, coupled with a bad one. It's almost like they had to do something that's good for the environment, and then to balance it out, something that's quote unquote good for the economy. And even the logic that they're using is fundamentally flawed. But as we have been discussing, that's often the case. The French government said that they want to cut emissions by 40% by 2030 compared to the 1990 levels. There's already that issue. Just to kind of bring in, I know that there was a public discussion recently on Twitter without mentioning any names, if that's okay. But I mean, I will link it anyway. Giulio, especially, like, you recently responded to a tweet downplaying the impact of air travel. I will say that this is something that I've encountered myself, not just when it comes to air travel, but when it comes to like food, when it comes to transportation in general as well. It is true that a lot of the time focus is like there's too much focus on personal habits and personal consumption. That's definitely true. But what that person was saying, which Giulio, you responded to that, is that, basically going the other way around, the other extreme. That doesn't really matter in terms of individual impact, whereas we actually know that it does, especially when it comes to food, which is something that I focus on a lot. But anyway, can you sort of just explain from your perspective, like some of these misconceptions when it comes to aviation, but I guess it might even apply to car transport. To be honest, I'm not sure, but definitely with aviation is something that I've seen a lot. So yeah, can you just explain a bit of that and why you disagree with it?
Yeah, so basically, I took advantage of that tweet to push my own agenda, which was like trying to dispel these misconceptions around air travel. So going through them one by one, like what this person was saying was that flying is just 3% of all CO2 emissions. So there are a lot of things wrong with that. First one being that it's not just because something is 2 or 3% of CO2 emissions that you should ignore it. Because if you slice your pie in enough slices, they will all be just 3% of the pie. If you have 33 slices, doesn't mean that then you just get to ignore all of them. Germany is 2% of CO2 of CO2 emissions. That doesn't mean that Germany doesn't get to decarbonize, right? Although some politicians really argue just that. So that's something that we call whataboutism. It's just not a good reason to ignore a sector. And I think the best pushback on this argument, someone made it on Twitter, and they said, "Look, like China accounts for 20% of global emissions, but China consists of 10 provinces, right? So each of those 10 provinces accounts for 2%. So none of them has to decarbonize, right? Um, so it just goes to show it's just a reduction ad absurdum, right? It just goes to show why it's just not a good argument. But like the reason why it's particularly inappropriate for air travel is that actually air travel is incredibly carbon intensive. So like if you wanted to spend an hour and just use it to just contribute to global warming as much as you can, there are probably very few things that you can do that pollute more than just flying, right? So the only reason why it doesn't account for more than 3% globally is that very few people fly. Like just I think it's in the single digits of or 10% of people in the world like fly on a regular basis, and they tend to be in the global north and so on. So it's incredibly unequal, and also within countries, like in European countries, 50% or more of the population doesn't fly at all in a regular year. And then there's a minority of frequent flyers who account for a whole lot of emissions, even within those countries. So given those inequalities, the only reason why it accounts for 3% is that very few people do it. And I've got a very colorful metaphor for this dilemma, but I'm not going to say here. But anyway, it just shows that that argument really doesn't hold water. Um, and the other reason is that some people, like the author of that tweet, feel that there is too much attention on air travel. I don't think that's the case. But one of the reasons why there is so much attention, at least in the research, I mean, there isn't that much attention in the research community, but those who push for more attention do it on various bases. But one of them is that like carbon emissions related to air travel are just skyrocketing. Like they've more than doubled in the last 30 years in Europe. like emissions from international travel. So that's really the opposite of the direction that we should be going. So in sectors like domestic housing, in domestic energy, like things are getting better, not as fast as they should. In things like road transport, they're not getting better, but they're not getting massively worse. They're sort of, I mean, at least in places like Europe. Air travel is just getting massively worse. So it's 3% now, but it will be much more in the future. So we should rather tackle this problem now when it's something that few people do frequently, rather than in 20 years when it will really be a mass thing and it will be much harder to roll back. So that would be my argument there. But then the other argument is that a lot, linking more to the kind of stuff that Giulio does, like a lot of air travel is really about luxury, not need, right? Like people tend to think that a lot of air travel is for business travel. It's not. Business travel is minority. Like most of air travel is for tourism, international tourism, long haul international tourism. Those things contribute a lot to air travel emissions. So if we need to start cutting somewhere, perhaps we should, start from the the third holiday to Thailand of someone living in a rich country as opposed from the heating of someone living in a poor country, right? It just this logic of wants and needs and luxury and necessities that justifies the attention on air travel as well, from my point of view. Yeah, and the last misconception about air travel is that there's this idea that we just need to make public trains better, and that was sorted out, but it's not, because yeah, we need to make trains better, and things like the French initiative, to some extent, it is a good idea, but a lot of the emissions from air travel come from long haul flights, and there is really no. I mean, there are alternatives, but certainly people would not take holidays to the other side of the world in the same way they do now, in a system that is not based on air travel. So this idea that we just have to wait until the alternative is ready and then we'll all shift to that, and in the meantime we'll keep flying, it's just doesn't work. I think that was enough misconception. I don't know if Giulia, you want to add to it.
I think it's quite complete, but I think one of the things that's really important is and this is something that I think people on the left in general tend not to be climate deniers as much, but don't really want to touch consumption. And so it's a question of, oh, we shouldn't be touching social progress effectively, and social progress is understood as consumption. So I think that that's already a first not to break, is like we need to understand social progress as different from consumption and consumerism. We have a different story to tell here. And in terms of my research, one of the things we see is we see social progress as being due not to consumerism or individual consumption, but to very clearly the availability of public services. And that might sound basic, but you can see it. So that's one thing. And in terms of, so we have to be willing to face the fact that consumption can't stay the same, can't increase like crazy, and that it's like the critiques of GDP. It's like saying GDP is not a good measure of social progress. Not every dollar spent in the economy has the same outcome in terms of its social benefit, and not every kilowatt hour or gigajoule spent in the economy has the same social benefit. And if you're going to look at gigajoules spent with low social benefit, that result in a lot of emissions, air travel is pretty much up there. So that's also something we really need to start asking ourselves the questions of what we're going to do. And one of the things we can do with flying, because it affects that it really affects the richest of the rich, is do something like a frequent flyer levy, where your first flight might be cheap, but your second, third, etc., the cost goes up. And what you can do with that is you can fund things like housing retrofit to reduce energy poverty, which is a thing that exists across Europe, where people don't have enough money to heat their houses because it costs too much and the housing quality is sometimes very poor. So there are things that we can really we need to understand how to help people who need to consume less and better through things like housing retrofit. That is crucially important. Housing retrofit is like the thing that needs to happen. But at the same time, we need to be willing to say this other consumption should stop. It's a problem. We need to tax it. We need to stop it from happening. And the same thing with consuming large cars, SUVs and four-wheel drive cars and so on, that's the drift in Europe. I mean, I can't leave my house without getting whacked in the head by, 17 of them going down these tiny streets. And it's like nobody needs them. The people who drive in mountains in Switzerland don't have them because they're a risk and they flip over themselves when it's steep or icy. That's that kind of top heavy car is the last thing you want. They're only a status symbol, and people often when they buy them, they don't even realize that they're sort of committing to riding roughshod over their children's future, basically. So I think that we have to be able to problematize consumption and say some consumption is not okay, and some consumption needs to be changed. So that's really something we need to face up to.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I opened the document just by the stay grounded network just to emphasize what you both just said. Just in terms of numbers, only 1% of the world's population causes 50% of commercial aviation emissions. So especially for people on the left, I think the whole 1% should ring some bells. While more than 80% of the world's population have never set foot on an airplane. This is from the Stay Grounded in PCS discussion paper, February 2021. And just other numbers that just kind of put things in perspective. Like as of August 2020, governments or government-backed entities from 57 countries had committed 137 billion euros in taxpayer-funded financial aid to airlines. 38% of the projected revenue loss for airlines for 2020, basically. So many. I won't say too much because the other episode was almost exclusively on that, although we did also touch upon degrowth, I should say. And as you said, Giulio, like aviation is the most climate harming mode of transport, and before the pandemic it was also the fastest growing source of greenhouse gases. The numbers I actually have here of CO2 and non-CO2 effects account for 5.9% of all human-caused global heating. I mean, just to kind of strengthen that same argument in many ways, this is something that's a problem, and not thinking about it in the global north, especially, which is where we all are, and that person making that tweet was as well. And most people usually making that argument, from what I've seen, are in the global north. That's something that I think we just don't take into consideration because we don't have to live with the consequences of it, at least not in the short term. I have a question about the IPCC, but it will be a bit of a weird pivot, so I will ask something else before. If that's okay. Yeah. So there's more of a personal question, if that's okay. It's one that I've tried to approach in these episodes when it comes to the climate crisis in general, but not just. I know that there's a tendency of viewing science in general as being apolitical. And I think this tends to obfuscate ways in which scientists themselves have to work in systems in the real world. I won't take this too far because I think if I then just say, well, science is political, then some people who are bad, not well-meaning, let's say, might then conclude then it doesn't matter. It's just one form of whatever among others, and that's obviously not what I'm saying. I think I'm trying to reach some kind of balance between the two, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Julia, I know this is something that you yourself have spoken about in previous interviews. So I wanted to ask you and you both, if that's okay, if you could share a bit of your own journey regarding how you've been thinking about science, so not just doing science, but thinking about it, if that makes sense. And also related to that, this is where I talk a lot about climate anxiety and a lot about just something that I obsess about quite a lot. How do you deal with a lot of the psychological challenges, let's say, or like I'm sure you worry about the climate a lot, which would make sense. So how do you deal with all of that in your respective contexts?
So I guess I can start with that one. So I think I have a bunch of answers to these kinds of questions because they do come up. And I think one of the things to realize in terms of climate science, I mean, the natural science is just there, the physical science, the energy engineering. I mean, you can start as soon, the arguments generally start when you get to the economic side of things. How much do things cost? But even there, you can get data, so you can sort of tell. But I think one of the things that was not taken seriously enough is that even this climate science and natural science, when it was starting to be published and done more seriously in the, let's call it the 70s, 80s, whatever, when things were starting to get started as a topic, that it was entering a terrain that was already politicized by the other side, that it turns out that this science could never be neutral or accepted as a neutral thing because the other side, i.e., the fossil fuel industry, had already done their own science, decided that climate change was real, and that they were going to fight doing anything about it forever. And they really made their decision on that quite early and have stuck with it. And so that I think that was really a nasty shock for scientists to realize that it kept coming as a surprise how much attack they were getting. And so for me, one of the things that I want to understand is I want to understand how we've known so much, the question that Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway ask themselves, which is a research question, a science question, which is how come we knew so much and did so little? So is doing a lot of work here. Some scientists knew so much and we're trying to get the word out, and we did so little. Well, who has power to do anything, et cetera? Not future generations and so on. I mean, not the global south necessarily. But how come we knew so much and did so little? And I think one of the reasons, one of the answer to that is to be found in politics, is to be found in the politicization of the science. So in my view, it's not possible to be effective in changing course, which is obviously the goal. The goal here is to change course and reduce emissions really fast. And we can't do that if we don't understand how the science has been politicized by what I would call the adversary, by an adversarial industry, by adversarial economic and political interests. And so that for me is a research question. And the more I learn about it through the work of people like Naomi Oreskes, or Jeffrey Supran or Ben Franta or others, the more it radicalizes me, because the more we learn about this stuff, including through lawsuits and other investigations, the more we see how this industry has really been buying up our politicians, buying up our politics, buying up our government, including through these things like road subsidies and, through direct and indirect means. Our governments are basically funneling tax money to these industries who are trying to kill us. And that makes me angry. And that does make me political. That wants me to change the government and it wants me to change the economy. So I would say that my politicization is, in some sense, you can disagree with the conclusions or you could disagree with whatever. But in terms of asking the questions and trying to understand what's going on, I would say that I'm more politicized by the scientific reality of the way that um, science has been disregarded, that the scientific reality of climate science has been disregarded for decades and ineffective for decades and stopped for decades. That's the thing that's actually turning me to more, the answer to why that's been happening is political. And the more you learn about it, the more you want to change the political system. And then of course you get called political. But I would just say that that's the terrain of the fight. That's the terrain of where change needs to happen, is the politics and economics of it. Um, so I think that, and what I do when people accuse me of being political is I generally point out that, for instance, mainstream economics is not apolitical. That if you're taking the side of neutral markets, and supply and demand equilibrium and optimal cost curves, that's not a neutral position. That is a political position. But for some reason, as soon as as long as you say, oh, well, things must be cost effective, which the fossil fuel industry has never cared about being particularly cost effective, by the way. As soon as you say that, you're accepted as an apolitical actor, and you're invited on television shows to say about how we shouldn't move too fast on climate and so on, and we should have a smooth, gradual transition and not have full-on wartime effort. And it's like, that is a political position, but you're not calling it that because it's mainstream. So I think it's really about, for me, it's also about advocating for a diversity of academic voices. So maybe I'm going to be called political, but if you're going to call me political, you better call all those other people that you've been calling apolitical, who are rah capitalism and growth. That is a political position too. So that's one view. In terms of the climate depression or whatever, climate anxiety. I think there's a lot of that. The only thing that helps is doing stuff, doing this kind, trying to understand it is sort of the why we're in the conundrum we're in. Because the more we understand about why we're in this pickle, the more we might understand about how to get out of it. So back when people thought it's just about getting the science across, well, it turns out it's not just about getting the science across. The science has always been there. It's always been true. It's about who we and Giulio was very influential in putting together this paper on discourses of delay against climate action. They move the discourse. The discourse is whatever they want it to be, as long as we don't do anything. So for me, it's very helpful to be able to participate in research where we understand why we're stuck in at this late time, at this late hour. And if we understand a bit more about how we're stuck, then maybe we understand a bit more about how to get out of it. And that's why it's been really it's been a great thing in my life to be able to work with Giulio, actually, because he's very good at doing that kind of stuff about understanding what's going on. So I will pass it to him on that note.
Yeah, okay, I'll carry on from that. But like, first of all, likewise, it was great for me to work with Julia. I think we complemented each other well in many ways. So yeah, my like just the way I'm built, my mind tends to go to, the risk of bad things happening and what prevents what makes us stuck and all things like that. And I realized that for many people these are the topics that people tend to avoid, especially in research. Like people would be more attracted to, how can we make things better, how can we, push this new innovative solution which will solve everything. And just, I know, it's just a question of taste at the end of the day. My mind doesn't go there. It goes to the other thing. It goes to the aviation, which is getting worse. It goes to the SUV, which is getting worse. And I don't think I'm objective of balanced in that respect. No, like I wouldn't want the scientific community to, of people like me more than a certain percentage. But I think it's good to have people who are more inclined in that way, because to balance out, right? To make a balance. Um, and that links to the question around how we get with the whole, depression around climate and so on. I think for me it's doing this work and working on these topics and being able to work on these topics is almost cathartic in a way, because when I realize sometimes I get bad news, like, I don't know, the latest awful thing the certain Ministry of Transport has said about climate policy, which doesn't make sense and contributes to delay. And I realize I'm almost happy when I hear those things. I think, oh, I can use it for this and that, And then I realize, I mean, I know it sounds a bit perverse, but I think it is one way of, taking these negative things happening and try to harness it, and through my work try and contribute to make things better. And I think in the back of my mind, there's the idea that if I can do that, I can perhaps do something good for others as well as good for me, just because I've happened to have this psychological makeup. And so that's how it works for me. Having said that, when it goes from -20 to +20 in the space of a week, or 10 days, like it happened here in Dortmund this spring, and I just look around and see people who are very happy about, how warm it is, I do feel a bit, like, oh guys, but does anyone else feel like me, really? This can't be right. So yeah, there are moments like that, but I think doing this work is a way in which I helps me keep sane relative to climate, I suppose.
Yeah, just mentioning the temperature changes here in the past couple of weeks as well. It's been quite something. Went from one day it snowed in the morning for like a couple of hours, and then I think the afternoon or the day after it was pretty hot. It just and yeah, I wasn't what you just said was kind of how I was freaking out. I just freaked out. I had to actually calm myself down. I went on a walk. I had to, because yeah, it's just one of those things. And the way it's talked about even between friends is like, well, the weather is nice now, let's go out. That's, which makes sense. But there isn't that other but like when you mentioning like I'm also like the both of you. I try and take in as much as I can, but for the purpose of actually doing something with it, not just taking it in and then just being overwhelmed with that information. But it contrasted. So I do cultural studies. I watch a lot of stuff and I analyze them. I look at the rhetoric in movies and discourse and that sort of thing. And there is an episode of the Newsroom, the American TV show, which is on climate change. And basically, the host just invites a climate scientist to talk about the climate. And the title of the YouTube video summary, I just found it just to kind of emphasize, it's the climate change debate is long over and there's nothing we can do. That was the conclusion. It's as close as I remember seeing, and even in a one of those TV series that are supposed to be objective, or at least that's sort of supposed to be the, because it's about journalism, it's about professional journalistic integrity, always looking for the facts, always being critical, challenging power, etc. And yet this was just taken for granted, essentially, that, well, we lost the battle and there's nothing we can do, essentially. That was like, 10 years ago or something. So this is just one of the many examples in which Giulia, you mentioning the failures essentially of recognizing that the playing field wasn't neutral, that there was actually playing field in the first place. This is one of the ways in which that is done. It's either that we shouldn't think about it because, quote unquote, the economy, or there's no point thinking about it because it's too late anyway, and so on and so forth. But this kind of, in a semi-awkward segue, but I think it is related. A lot of the ways internationally, anyway, the main institutions have been trying to deal with it is through something like the IPCC, the Intercontinental Panel on Climate Change. Giulia, if you don't mind just mentioning a bit your work on that, and I mean, as much as you can share, and if there are challenges, concerns regarding the IPCC, or regarding even the way it's presented or the way it's understood at the public level, what have you, really anything. I would just be curious to hear from you on that.
Okay. So so I can say a few things. I mean, the IPCC so I'm lead author on working group. I mean, there's all these acronyms. Oh my God! But like any big organization, I guess. So I'm on working group 3, which is on climate mitigation. And I think that the division in working groups is actually already a problem. I mean, it kind of makes sense. You want to divide the science up. So working group 1 is physical science, working group 2 is impacts and adaptation, working group 3 is mitigation, so trying to stop it. And one of the reasons the special report on 1.5 degrees, I think, was so effective, because a lot of people know that one is one of the most recent comprehensive ones to come out. And I think in general, the special reports, there's also been a special report on land and a special report on oceans and the cryosphere. But the special report on 1.5 degrees, one of the reasons it was effective is because people from all 3 working groups were actually working together on it. Now, I wasn't on that one, but I think that was actually a strength, because otherwise we tend to sort of compartmentalize these different things. And it's really when you bring them together in their magnitude, like, this is the physics of it, this is the bad stuff that's going to happen, this is what it's going to take to stop it. When you bring it all together, that you really get the full magnitude of what we're up against and what needs to change. But it's basically glorified literature review. We're supposed to represent all the literature that's come out since the last assessment report. We have a process where we're divided. It's very hierarchical. It's a bit like the army. We're organized in chapters, which are I guess a bit like platoons or something. I don't want to take the military metaphor too far, especially because my chapter bosses might be inspired by it, make us do push-ups or something. No, they're lovely. But so we had each chapter. So the division of the content into chapters is done by governments before the scientists. Well, some scientists are there at that point, but so we arrive in a chapter. We have to take the chapter themes forward and fulfill the content of that chapter. And then we have this process of iterative review. So anybody and their cousin and their cat can be a reviewer. And then we have to take this long spreadsheet of reviews. So I think everybody in my chapter was really happy because this time I think we had less than 2,000 reviewer comments on our chapter. But to me, it still seems like a lot. So, but anyway, so we have to respond and publicly and transparently and take things into account, but also cut it down to length as well. And then we have at the end of the multiple year process, we have a report. So that's sort of what we're trying to do. At the same time, one of the things that needs to happen in the IPCC is we need to have a summary for policymakers. So we need to bring all the information in the report up to these summary points. So the summary points have to have a clear traceability to content in the chapters that is backed up by lots of science. But we also have to create this sort of consistent narrative story that people can get what the main points are. And that's probably the most challenging part. And everybody tries to sort of contribute, but it's and that's also the most contentious part at the end in terms of like the government sort of they have to agree, they have to accept the report. And at the plenary meeting, they go through the summary for policymakers line by line and bring up their disagreements. And then it's a fight, and it could be a fight between governments or a fight between the scientists and the governments. And so that's when things get very stressful. And that's also why the leaders of the IPCC are sort of guiding us towards that process, because the more robust the report is, the less that process is difficult, is the general idea. So that's sort of where things are at. And we're not, as authors, we're not allowed to talk about internal discussions, and we're not allowed to talk about specifics of what's in the report or not. But sometimes I kind of want to, because then I could get kicked off and not have to do all the work. So that would be great. So, but that's sort of the way things are run.
Okay. Well, no, thanks for that. I had an episode, so that's 62 for those listening, on how to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, a societal transformation scenario, with Kai Cunningham and Linda Schneider. And based on a report that they worked on, they were not the only ones, for the Heinrich Boll Stiftung and Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie. So yeah, just putting it out there. We talked about some of these topics as well on the IPCC and that sort of thing, and just so that we don't repeat ourselves too much here. I had a question about economics itself, but we sort of answered it already. I will just ask you, also mostly Giulia. Giulia, I don't know if you'll have to add, but up to you. So before entering the book section, I just have like one question. Giulia, I know that you work in ecological economics. Can you just explain what that is? It's something I'm personally very curious about, and if you can explain what ecological economics does differently, or at least strives to do differently than quote unquote mainstream economics.
Sure. And to make things more complicated, there's actually a branch of mainstream economics that does things related to the environment called environmental economics. And if you don't necessarily care, or why would you, it turns out that environmental economics and ecological economics are totally different things. So what ecological economics does differently is it takes the environment seriously as a framework condition, a boundary condition. So the economy cannot destroy the environment. So we set ourselves as a challenge. We see the environmental risks that we're facing as a central challenge to the way we should be understanding and doing economics as research. Whereas mainstream economics sees the environment as sort of a small externality it needs to fix or something, or internalize, or put a price on. So that is not our approach at all. We basically, what we're saying is the economy should respect the rules and the boundary conditions of our environment, so that we don't undermine our life support systems. And that's the first condition. And however much we need to transform how we understand the economy and how it should work, we're up for that, including degrowth, including going up against, nobody wakes up in the morning and wants to go up against the central god of our whole societies and civilization and say, this is going to be great for my career. People are going to take me really seriously. Nobody's going to accuse me of anything outlandish, and it's all going to go easily and swimmingly. Like, nobody wants to do that. Nobody is that insane. But that's where we're at, you know. So if you follow the evidence, if you follow the studies or lack thereof on decoupling, et cetera, you really start getting to the point where you're like, okay, well, this is what we need to explore. And so we're willing to rethink the economy in terms of its social purpose. So that's another core aspect of ecological economics, is we have this dual approach. We want inequality to be reduced, we want deprivation to be reduced to nothing, but we also want environmental the not to be putting our entire species and ecosystems at risk through environmental degradation. And then within that, there are lots of different approaches. So it's a big tent. It's quite pluralistic. Maybe a bit too much. Who knows?
No, thanks for that. I think very visually, and I do like the notion of a donut economics, where you just have the for those who don't know, like you have an upper ceiling of basically the ecological limits, and the bottom ceiling is social limits, so like poverty levels, housing, that sort of thing. I'll definitely have some episode on that specifically at some point. Well, okay. I mean, this has been a really, really expansive conversation. I thank you both for it. If it's okay with you, can we just enter into the book section, in which I basically ask you to recommend 3 books that you like, and just talk about it and explain why you like them. It doesn't even have to be related, but yeah, up to you.
Yeah. So do you want? I had 3 which were like books which I read while preparing this paper. But I can branch out if
Up to you.
if
Up to you.
yeah. Okay. So then
Yeah.
I'll branch out. Like few things I've read recently. There's this book called Spillover about zoonoses. The author is David Quammen. It's about like zoonosis, so like diseases which pass from animals to humans, and it was published like a few years before Corona, but it's very prescient in that it says, oh, maybe the next big one could be a coronavirus, and there's a page like that. And the reason why I think it fits into this context is that like it's doesn't have to do with climate, but the book makes the point very clearly of how like the increase in incidence of these zoonoses has to do with the impact of human activity on the environment. So that just us going there and cutting forests and invading certain animal habitats and so on is the ultimate origin for the fact that these zoonoses seem to happen more and more. So it's another like environmental crisis, if you want. And more on the questions of political and social justice, I've just read The Grapes of Wrath by, what's his name? I forgot. That's embarrassing. Faulkner? Is it
Steinbeck.
John Steinbeck.
Steinbeck? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot the author, but I remember the book. Anyway, that was good. And what else? Um, yeah, can I stick to those 2? Or
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. So I've been trying to. A lot of people have been asking me for reading recommendations, and there are a lot of sort of transformative book. There are a lot of books that sort of help transform or decode the way we can sort of see the world. But I think one of the most important ones for me has been Decolonizing the Mind by I'm gonna get his name wrong, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's a Kenyan writer, and that's a short book and an excellent book, and it really changes a lot of things. And um, there have been a whole bunch of great books that have come out on degrowth that I've really enjoyed reading, so I'm still going through them. But Less is More by Jason Hickel and Degrowth in Movements by Matthias Schmelzer were both really good. I've been saying a lot of good things about Less is More, so you should just go read that one. Well, and also Donut Economics by Kate Raworth and so on. But I think Degrowth in Movements was very good for me because it basically asks people in different social movements how they see degrowth, and that was really helpful for me in terms of navigating like what a refugee group, a refugee support group, how they would sort of interact with economic concepts and bring that into their advocacy, or how people who are organizing local bike repair shops, like basically all different kinds of actors in these kinds of social movements and how they see the world. So I thought that was really helpful because you don't get that very often, like just asking people, hey, how do you see this? So I thought that was great.
Can I have the third one then? So
Yes.
I feel bad now, which I haven't. So since Julia hasn't mentioned it, I wanted to mention Ian Goff's book, Heat, Greed, and Human Need, which I think is a very good summary of many of the things where Julia's project was coming from, and particularly he makes a very good case about like why we need to reconfigure consumption, as he puts it. And I really like how he writes, because it's like when you read something Ian Goff's like written, it's very hard to deny it. I don't know if you feel the same way, like Julia. Like it just argues in such a good way that it just leaves you no way of, you just have to surrender to that argument basically.
That's a great book.
Yeah.
Awesome. On that note, thank you both for this. It has really been great and like a really productive conversation.
Thanks, Joey.
Thank you.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.